And I'm the director here at the Wolfsonian, and it is very kind of you to all come out on this beautiful day to hear about Deco and death. Not a subject that inspires you to come in from the sunshine, so I very much appreciate you being here today. We are going to talk about a lot of different topics in today's lecture, so I hope you bear with me. The idea of these talks, and I usually do about 2 of them every year, is to give me an opportunity to kind of speculate and to think about the material that we hold, or more pertinently, that we have on display, so that we can think about it in new or different ways. So we have a beautiful Art Deco exhibition up on the 7th floor, which I of course encourage you all to go and look at. And if you haven't, please do so after this lecture. I think you'll look at it differently. But when you go up to see that exhibition, you'll see nothing in there about anything that I'm going to talk about today, really, or very, very little. And that is the point of these talks. I am really attempting to help you understand that you can always look at this material from a number of different perspectives and consider it in a number of different lights. Now, before I get there, I do want to thank a few people and then do a couple of little announcements. First, I want to thank the Miami Design Preservation League for partnering with us on this entire series of talks here at the Wolfsonian and, of course, at the Preservation League as well. This is an ongoing relationship that we are very, very proud of. I think we are natural partners, and we created this Art Deco exhibition in order to really show our support for everything that they do, but also to bring out material that I don't think a lot of people have seen before. So I want to thank everybody who's involved with them. I want to encourage you to think about becoming involved with us. If you're not already a member, please consider joining. Membership is a very important part of how it is that we make a museum like this work. And so if you're not a member, consider becoming a member of our family. You can do so at the gift store today. They would be happy to kind of walk you through that form and help you become a member today. I also want to thank my staff, who have been really wonderful. We've been doing a number of different events, and there have been many, many staff members here. Danielle is new to us, and I just want to thank Danielle for all of her labor. Thank you, Danielle. Now, as I said, I'm going to talk about Art Deco from a perspective I think that's rather unusual. But before we go down that dark path, I thought maybe I should take you on the light path, so you can keep that in mind as I'm talking. And so I think I'll begin with a video.
Hello. Won't you come in?
So I'm sure you enjoyed Top Hat. For those of you that haven't seen it, I encourage you to go out and see the entire film. That was obviously a highly edited version of the introduction to Top Hat. And that is a film that is often considered to be the epitome of Art Deco glamour. And I think you can see why. I just want to run through some of the things to think about, though, as you were looking at that, because I will come back to it at the very end of this talk, and perhaps we'll look at it in a slightly different way. There are a number of things that you should be, I think, remembering as you're thinking about that little clip that I just showed you. First, the interiors were incredibly beautiful, yes, but also very sterile at the same time. They were extraordinarily white, including Ginger Rogers, who I don't think could be any whiter, her hair. And so you'll notice that there was this high contrast between the light and the dark, but it was really dominated by that really almost like shiny white, as if it was not part of our own reality. This was definitely a fantasy that was being created for us. You'll notice that there was almost no nature to be seen, and certainly nothing like a view out a window, any kind of natural element. All of it was very much made by humans, and it was all very highly coordinated and decorated. All of it kind of worked together to create kind of a perfect ensemble. You'll notice that the two characters were very high energy. They were young, or they were trying to appear young. They may not have been quite as young as they were being portrayed there, but nonetheless, they were highly energetic. I think you can't doubt that Fred Astaire was in incredibly wonderful shape as he was producing this. And so they're healthy, and they're looking vibrant. They're also very, very enamored with one another. It doesn't take a genius to know how this is going to go, right? These two are going to end up together in one way or another. So we have a love story at the heart of all of this, based on two beautiful people who are the kind of the epitome of their health and well-being in this artificial environment where they can create this fantasy of love. And that's certainly how the movie is going to go. There's a couple of other things to notice here. This is a very urban scene. This is very much meant to evoke a city and a city life. This is not a rural farm scene, for instance, and I think you get that immediately. You'll also notice that there's certain class implications here. This is not about poverty or poor people. These are about people who are extremely well off and doing quite well for themselves. You can tell that in all manners of their presentation. Now, in case you think that that's an anomaly, it's not. And for those of you who know films during this period, you'll know that there are many others that use Art Deco kind of visual language in order to present the same basic ideas. I wanted to show you just a still from another film and pull out a couple of other details. This is Our Dancing Daughters from 1928. And you'll notice here, I think, the play of class a little bit more than in the previous clip that I just showed you, because you have a woman here who's obviously a servant or a maid who is helping this woman dress. You'll notice that the woman who is dressed is very much in the latest of Art Deco styles. She is surrounded by an interior that really speaks of Art Deco. Notice a skyscraper-like form behind her, something you're going to see repeated in many pieces of Art Deco. You can also see it with sconces and in other objects throughout the room. But I think that it's also curious to note subtle things like the shape of her dress and even her haircut in relation to the furniture. Notice you have a repeating of the same basic curves and shapes, as if she is just one more decorative object in this entire ensemble that's been created here for you to really enjoy, to take in, to basically feast your eyes upon this. And she then becomes just one more of these ornaments. Now I'm going to run through just a few of the objects that we have upstairs so you can see how this plays out in the decorative arts when we look at them individually. I've just shown you two images, a video, and a still, in which you saw how they were brought together collectively, all the different decorative arts, but here we'll look at them individually, but very quickly, because you can go upstairs and see the real thing, which is always so much better on the slide. I just want to point out here in this medallion a couple of common motifs of Art Deco. First, the very healthy, nubile young body. both male and female, as you're going to see in just a few moments, usually semi-naked, if not completely naked. And there's a kind of a gesture, if you will, to the classical past, particularly with the drapery, that has been very stylized. And you're going to see that kind of fluted form used throughout Art Deco. It's often associated with the beauty and the beauty industry, and this is not an accident, because it's during the same period that many of the major manufacturers of beauty products came into being. So Revlon Cosmetics was started in 1932, Lancome in 1935, and Maybelline in 1915. And so really the rise of the cosmetic industry in the 20th century is very much associated with the Art Deco style. These two things went hand in hand very, very well. And so you can see it used in advertisements, but you can also see it used in all of the items and how they're designed. The compacts, the lipstick holders, the cigarette holders, all of the different things associated with feminine beauty became associated with Art Deco. Now, this was taken one step further by all of the different department stores who became very invested in this Art Deco language or style, and they started to literally design their stores based on this idea. So you had the objects that they were selling in a particular style, but then you have the store itself built in that style. And so the architecture was mirroring the decorative arts of that time. They took it a step further, of course, and then put it into their advertisements like you see here. And here's an example of the male figure being used in a decorative way. I don't think that we think often enough about how the male figure has also been used as a decorative form throughout the 20th century, because we've become more and more obsessed with the female form, and I think that's starting to change. But you can see in the Art Deco period, it was both male and female. Another male figure showing how this Art Deco language was really extraordinarily flexible. It allowed it to be integrated into a variety of different purposes, such as advertisements for all things related to modern life, particularly engineering and electricity, technology, all of that kind of brought together here in this wonderful, and this is a very large piece. I do encourage you to go upstairs and look at it. It's one of Wolfsonian's best pieces, I think, and in remarkable shape as well. But you can see how all of these things are kind of united together. Now, it makes sense at a visual level. I mean, it kind of holds together very nice in terms of the graphics, but it makes absolutely no sense in terms of the iconography that's being presented here. You've got this kind of Native American Egyptian figure with the corn kind of behind him, radiating electricity and trains. I mean, it really becomes very far-fetched, but it all kind of was woven together under this visual language of prosperity, the future, a fantasy of a good life. You can see that architecture was very much a part of the Art Deco language. You have literally the skyscraper form that I pointed out to you in the film still, but here you can see an actual representation of it, again with a semi-nude classical-ish figure, and then a variety of different floral motifs that were often very common in Art Deco as well. Now this one is one of my favorites. It's in the show, and it kind of shows you how elastic this style actually was, and how it could incorporate so many different things to the point of being ridiculous. And so here you have this semi-nude woman with pearls. I love that touch. With pearls, just enough drapery, you know, to contain her modesty, and then she just happens to be holding an airplane. Why wouldn't she? But all of it somehow or another comes together and reads at first glance as being very glamorous. It certainly has this glow and the patina of the material itself, but also all of the languid forms are very sensual, and so it kind of somehow comes together, and in our minds we look beyond it and enter into the fantasy that was being created for us. So that's Art Deco. You're going to hear a lot of different talks today, and so you're going to hear all about the various ways in which you can articulate the style when it started, who did what, when, how was it transformed, how was it moved from one country to the other, all of the kind of intricacies that I think go into any kind of analysis of any style. But what I'm attempting to do is something a little bit trickier, and that I want to interpret against the surface. I want to look at Art Deco, not in terms of what everything I've just talked about, the kind of surface fantasy that's being presented, but I want to look at kind of the underlying, what I feel is reality that was fueling this movement, that was giving it kind of energy in order to compel people to be intrigued and to purchase and to consume these objects. And so that's going to take me to a slightly different place. Now, let me explain how it is that I see this. I'm going to have to talk just a moment here about interpretation of things in order to get us to this next stage of my talk. Now, typically, if I wanted to talk about the horrors of World War I wanted to talk about how it affected the psyche of people and how that was being represented in art, I would go to something like what you see here, a painting by George Grosz. And this is George Grosz's painting of a suicide. George Grosz fought in the trenches during World War I. He was particularly traumatized, and he was released from service, and then kind of carried that trauma for the rest of his life. It radically changed his art, and he depicted, some very intense emotions related to the destructiveness of World War I. And certainly you can see that here in the painting called Suicide. A figure here who has committed suicide, the spirit kind of leaving the body, a little red dog. Dogs are generally a sign of fidelity, and so that's why they're often shown like near a coffin, because they're faithful to their master even after death. You'll notice this dog's leaving the scene, as if, really not going to stay. You can see another death by hanging up above. You can see this kind of seedy underbelly that is really being critiqued in terms of society that created the kind of horrors of World War I, but then the aftermath of World War I as well. So you have a prostitute up there, and you have kind of a bourgeois manufacturer type behind her. So you have all of these different elements, and I should point out, you also have the church. It is certainly not blameless in all of this situation. George Grosz is a trenchant critic, and he certainly doesn't leave anything unturned. Well, you can see what I just did. You take the biography of the artist, the lived experience that we know, you connect it to the work of art, and then you look at the work of art in terms of its iconography, but you can even go deeper. You can talk about the colors, you can talk about the composition, all of it kind of adding up to this scene of horror and death. So I think that most people would go on that journey with me and believe what I'm saying. However, when you look at the trivet next to it, that's done in an Art Deco style from about the same year, and I say to you, underlying that trivet is death. You have a harder time going with me, don't you? Because there's nothing on the surface of that appears to represent death or the destructiveness of World War I, anything associated with really the horrors of that time. I would contend, though, that that is part of this object. And it's part of the object through the denial of those things, and that is part of the role of the decorative arts. Imagine, if you will, and I think that this might be rather obvious once you kind of get it into your mind, that you surrounded yourself in your house with objects that reminded you of kind of the horror of everyday life. The death, destruction, poverty, could await any one of us at any moment. And, instead of having, a trivet that kind of announces good times, dancing, frivolity, nice trees and floral arrangements, instead, it says death nearby, or it shows a big skeleton, it's like burn yourself, you might die. So we tend not to surround ourselves with that narrative, even though it's very much part of our lives. And instead, the decorative arts become like the Prozac of everyday life. It's the thing that kind of keeps us in a slightly elevated fantasy world that allows us not to have to face the grim realities of everyday life. And I think that's part of the function of the decorative arts. But I think you get misled if you think that the decorative arts are only about the fantasy, because the fantasy can only exist with its alternative. It can't really be fueled. It won't have its power without the anxiety, the angst, all of the underlying kind of tension that we feel has to fuel that fantasy. And I think that's what was occurring in Art Deco. So I'm going to walk you through this speculation on my part. Remember, this is a lot of speculation here, folks, and you can certainly ask me questions at the end of it. And so I do recognize that, I'm interpreting it against the grain here. So before we get a little bit further, you might ask yourself, why is he talking about this, and what led him down this crazy path? And I think that that's perfectly fair. I can't say that this was all my own doing. Last summer, for whatever reason, at the airport, I decided to pick up this book on Radium Girls. It's about radium poisoning, which I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes. Of all books, I know, I'm strange. And then I decided to pick up this one, Chasing the Cure in New Mexico, which is all about the TB epidemic and how people were moving to a variety of different locations, particularly in New Mexico in the West, in order to try to cure themselves in the teens and 20s. And then I've been reading Nagel Dodge Luhand and her account of syphilis and gonorrhea. And then I thought I'd just top it off with something about eugenics because, why not? And so that was my summertime reading. And all of them having to do with the same time period. This is kind of my scholarly interest. This is my time period. And so I do tend to choose books that kind of hone in on the teens, the 20s, and the 30s. And so all of these are looking at that, but from very, very different perspectives. And I wanted to do that because I was curious about kind of the larger social context for the creation of Art Deco. And I really wanted to reach deep and broad. I would say that none of these books, except for Eugenic Design, really talks about Art Deco. They talk about many other issues, but not that. And so I started to think about how these things actually come together, or at least came together for me. And one of the things that struck me as I was going through the books was a number of the images of young people in particular, because so much of what was having an impact on the health and well-being of young people was being described in these books. And so they were literally losing their lives. They were dying at very young ages, in their 20s and 30s, from things like TB in particular, but influenza and other things I'm going to be talking about. And I noticed that in the photographs of them, and this is one of the TB patients who, a poet, who moved to Santa Fe in order to try to save her life, that they were also very stylish dressed in kind of Art Deco related fashions. They had stylish haircuts, often bobs, as you're going to see in just a moment, and they were very much part of that kind of flapper moment of the 1920s. And I thought, what must it have been like to get up every day, knowing that you had a terminal illness, seeing people dying literally all around you, being exiled to a place like New Mexico where there is very little civilization, and you put on your best little Art Deco outfit to present yourself as beautifully as possible. And I just thought, what kind of psychology is that? How is that being worked out in their minds? And that's what I wanted to start to work with. Another photo of lungers. Lungers is just a name for people with TB that were being sent to the West. And they were being sent there because the theory was that the high, dry air was good for the lungs. They also sent them to Florida, however, to Miami, under the opposite idea that the humidity would also be good for them, but we had clean air. It was better in dry air, as it turns out, but nonetheless, they really weren't sure. And so here you can see a group of them in Albuquerque, and it was this woman here with that rather stylish short haircut that got my attention. Not only is she beautifully kind of presenting herself, but that haircut really shows that she was very much part of the time. Now, this notion that I have of trying to connect the decorative arts with health, particularly public health, isn't something that is truly just mine alone. Many people during the beginning of the 20th century into the 19th century were speculating about how it is that the decorative arts and craftsmanship, the making of things, could lead to better public health. And that what was happening with the rise of technology was this fear that people really weren't going to be able to use their bodies robustly, that machines were going to kind of take over for us, and that we would lose our health. Now, this is an argument that we're all dealing with right now with the rise of the computer. This is nothing new to any one of you. As we all think about our posture and what our necks are becoming as a result of computers, we're all kind of fearful of this new technology and what could happen to the body. Well, one of the anecdotes to this was the idea of physical labor, but even more particularly of craft and craftsmanship. And so it was the decorative arts that were looked at as a possibility for the renewal of the body, particularly the body public. Now, as I said, though, there were many different things that were afflicting people during this time period. Because I think you could argue, and some of you might want to question me about this at the end, that we're always dealing with the fear of death, right? Because we're mortal and we will only be here for so long, and horrible things happen all around us. And the decorative arts, I think, do serve a purpose, as I've said, kind of acting like the Prozac that keeps us up. But I would argue that during this period of the 1920s and the 1930s, the situation was even more extreme. And that's what I'm going to kind of walk you through so that you can really see what people were up against and why it is that they would have attached themselves to this kind of fantasy of Art Deco. The first thing that you should be aware of is that World War I from 1914 to 1918 really caused an incredible number of deaths. About 15 to 19 million people died during World War I. But an interesting number as well, 23 million people were wounded. So they lived, and then they went back out into civilization. Now, by and large, these were young people, because they were the ones that were drafted, and so they were part of the war. And so you had 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds on the street, missing limbs, all kinds of body parts. And you were dealing with that on kind of a daily basis. So most people knew somebody who died during World War I, but if they didn't, they certainly were seeing people who remained and injured during World War I as a constant reminder of what had been lost. I thought this was very intriguing. This kind of shows you all of the different ways that people lost various body parts because of the artillery that was used during World War I and the ways in which they tried to substitute those different, in this case, facial features so that you could have artificial eyes, noses, ears, etc., attaching them to glasses so they looked a little less apparent. But you know as well as I do that you would notice this. And so people were very aware of all of the different injuries that occurred during this time. Now, related to World War I was the Spanish flu epidemic. Now, it's argued that one of the reasons why World War I ended was because of the Spanish flu epidemic. That's kind of another discussion, but nonetheless, it had a very, very severe impact worldwide. It wasn't just simply in Europe or in America, but it was a worldwide phenomenon. It was estimated that 500 million people were infected. So 500 million people infected during this period of about 1918 to 1919. 20 to 50 million people died. That's 3 to 6% of the world's population at that time. And so just these two things alone are massive. And so I have some very interesting photographs here of people on the street, obviously concerned about influenza, and that's why they're wearing these masks. And here you can see how clarity about how it was being spread. So it's one thing for all of us to deal with a disease that affects many, many people. It's quite another thing to be faced with a disease that you don't understand how it's being spread. Because then it's no longer something that's happening to those people, it's about something that could happen to you. And so this is that kind of that sense of panic that I'm trying to recreate for you, that people must have been feeling during this time. Now, there was another little bizarre story in all of this that I don't think until recently got nearly as much attention, and that has to do with radium poisoning that was also occurring during this time, largely because it was being used in paints in order to illuminate clock dials, and that's what you can see here. And so if any of you have one of those historic clocks that illuminates at night, that's probably radium. You might want to reconsider that. But radium illuminated clock dials were particularly important for the airplanes that were flown during World War I, so that they would be able to see the dials at night. And so it became a really huge industry in the United States. People became rather enamored by the clocks that were being created. And so young women, and they were usually young women, were hired in order to do this very fine painting. The reason why they wanted young women is because of their dexterity, and they were often relatively inexpensive to hire because they weren't skilled labor at that point. And they were fairly flexible, so they were usually before the age of marriage, somewhere like about 15 to 20 in that general time frame. But here's the problem and how it is that so many of these young women became poisoned. You saw that brush that she had? For any of you that have ever tried to do fine work on porcelain or anything else, you know how you create a really fine tip on a sable hair brush? You put it in your mouth. And it's your saliva that has just enough stickiness to it to bring those hairs together to a fine point. And so these women were being paid by piece. And so every one of these dials they finished, they got like a penny. I mean, it was really very little money. But the more they did, the more they made. And the ones that were the best were the ones that were willing and to put it in their mouth in order to tip that brush in order to get it back into the paint. There were other ways, like you can put it in water, but water is a lot less effective and it dilutes the paint, and then that takes you more time. And so this was the preferred method. Now, at a certain point, it became apparent that a lot of these young women were having all kinds of really odd health problems. And what happens is that radium, once it enters the body, goes to the bones. And so at first, it looks like you're extremely healthy when you have radium poisoning because you flush, and people read that as a sign of health. But in reality, that's your body's reaction to the poisoning that's occurring, sending out more red blood cells. And so once it gets into your bones, it starts to literally eat you from inside. And that is a jawbone of one of the young women who died from radium poisoning. And this is one of those young women. We know a lot about them because they sued. These are the young women that really established our kind of health regulations in the United States, kind of workman comp, if you will, so that if you're injured on the job, you're able to get paid. There were a lot of restrictions around those laws that prevented them from collecting, and so they sued, and it is their case that really changed the way we think about health care for workers. And so she was extremely important, but I also, again, was struck by incredibly glamorous she was at the same time as she was dying. Now, it could affect various bones. It doesn't necessarily have to just be the jaw. Some of it would go to other bones. And so she looks very good here, but the reality is that she was actually quite ill. Now, the number of people who had radium poisoning and that worked in these factories was relatively low. So if I'm trying to establish this idea of a mass panic, if you will, that would have compelled people to take on Art Deco with fervor, then radium poisoning isn't the best example, because maybe 1,000 people might have died from it. But the PR and publicity was extreme because they were withholding from the general public the dangers of radium. Even after they knew it, the government knew it, and of course the manufacturers knew it at a much earlier time, but they were afraid of lawsuits. They were also afraid of losing their various industries. And so they weren't telling the public, and in the meantime, they were putting it in everything. And so, what's this? Those are condoms with radium so that they glow in the dark. Yeah, that was someone's clever idea. And over there, you can see some radium cream to give you that healthy glow, and you certainly would. Now, she has that really weird light on her because when you put it onto your face, you would literally glow in the dark. That was part of the quote-unquote glamour of radium. And so it was being added into makeups, it was being added into all kinds of different products. There was actually a health movement, and unfortunately it didn't take off, where people were consuming radium in order to better their health. And so they were taking radium pills. And of course, a lot of those people died. As I said, it didn't catch on as a fad. But these products were very well known. And so while you didn't really understand radium poisoning, all of a sudden it was everywhere, and you didn't really understand how it was being acquired and how much you needed and what it was going to do to you, and you might have very well used one of these products. And so you can see how that actually affected hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And then, of course, we have TB, in case that's not enough. That was threatening people right and left throughout the world. And it continues to be a problem to a certain degree, but not with the same kind of numbers that were common during that period. It was estimated that during this period, between 70 and 90% of urban populations were affected or infected with TB. Now, that doesn't mean that you were going to have symptoms, and it didn't mean that you were going to die, but nonetheless, it meant that you were infected. And so it has a very high infection rate, and it had also a very high death rate. Now, it is at this point in the talk where I'm going to start weaving together some of these health concerns with this Art Deco language, because they do start to come together. And you can see that here in this poster about preventing TB. You'll notice that the words are certainly scaring you, and during this time you would be scared because there was no cure that was guaranteed for TB. But it's combined with that lovely young woman with a flower, straight out of that kind of Deco language that we were talking about. And so it is her health and well-being that's at stake. But it's this contrast between these two things, this deadly disease and then this beautiful young woman here, that kind of gives this poster its spark, its energy, if you will, that pushes it forward into your mind so that you begin to think about the loss of youth and innocence here. During this period, advertisements started to become increasingly concerned with the idea of cleanliness, because there was a realization that so many of these diseases could be tied in some fashion or another to the notion of germs. Now, this was only starting to be kind of worked out scientifically, but nonetheless, there was enough information for people to know that the environments that they were living in were potentially causing them harm, and certainly not helping them. And so you can see here, this kind of sanitary bathroom of the 1920s became very much the standard of the norm, and we continue to live with it. You see that same bathroom to this day, and you can see historic examples of it all over time. And so these bathrooms became the height of scientific cleanliness in order to help prevent all of these different diseases, and again, to allow these young, graceful people, in this case of women, prosperity and a future. Here you can see it brought together again around syphilis. And so if TB wasn't going to get you, if influenza and radium poisoning didn't already have its way, well then you have the pleasure of knowing that you probably had syphilis or gonorrhea. Because during this time, about 10% of the population had syphilis. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that they were going to die, but they might have had various symptoms. and 20 to 40% of the population had gonorrhea. But one of the major fears with syphilis and gonorrhea, even during this time, if it wasn't necessarily death, although it could be death, but that generally wasn't the case, but it could affect your children, and it could, of course, affect your sex life and your ability to marry and to have those kind of wonderful Ginger Roger, Fred Astaire relationships. And so this was right on the surface. Mabel Dodge Luhan, in her book, talking about her run-ins with syphilis and gonorrhea, her first case was when she was 20, I think, the very first time she ever had sex. With a married doctor, she got syphilis, and then it kind of went into abeyance, and then it reoccurred, and she was reaffected at least 4 to 5 times in her lifetime. And so that was not uncommon, and it wasn't because she was having so much more sex than everybody else. It really just simply was the fact that it was so prevalent during this time, and there was so little that people understood how to prevent from getting it. I also wanted to point out in this poster how you have, again, those two Art Deco figures contrasted with this kind of horrificness, in this case, of syphilis. And another version of the same idea, but notice that it's the family that needs to be protected here. Notice the color of that family. They are as white can be. And so again, this heavy contrast between the light and the dark that's being played out in these posters. So then I started to think more about this relationship of Art Deco and health and design. And I was curious about finding objects that seemed to kind of bring that cluster of ideas together. And of course, the washing machine. What a perfect illustration of a machine that was meant to eliminate germs, to help us lead a cleaner life so that we could be healthier. And of course, done with this kind of Art Deco styling here, which is starting to transform into something that's generally called streamlined design, but nonetheless has its origins in Art Deco. And so you can see that now being played out here. None of this design is essential. You know that, because you all pretty much have flat fronted washing machines. You don't need all of that kind of broad surface there. You don't need those kind of skyscraper forms. That's all being done for some purpose. And it is in a way to compel you to consider consuming it or buying it, and that's true. It is interesting. But it's got to be more than that. It's got to have more fuel and oomph behind it to really compel you to want this washing machine over another. And why they would put that much time and effort and money into that design, which is unnecessary. It's got to be compelling in some fashion or another beyond, oh, that's nice. Because that's nice is not going to lead you to buy it. It's got to be something more. But here is my masterpiece of the talk, the thing I was the happiest about, the vacuum cleaner. So it's a little hard to read up here, but the name of this company, which was out of Massachusetts, was Modern Hygiene from 1942. Well, you know, it was like this little object was just made for my talk when I found it, and it's all red and pretty, and I really like that too. So look at that form. You know, it's all kind of streamlined, it's very Art Decoized for absolutely no purpose whatsoever. But it brings together, in terms of the company's name, all of these things I've been talking about. Modernity, right? This future that's going to be better, that's going to be safer, that's going to be cleaner. You know, this fantasy that's being created around the modern world. And hygiene, health, of course, is what it's referring to. But it's using the word hygiene in a kind of a pseudo-scientific manner, right? So it's like the sciences are going to help us out here in order to create this bountiful world. And then on top of it, design. You know, we'll make all of this pretty. You know, we'll make it red, and we'll make it chrome, we'll make it shiny. So there's pleasure to safeguard yourself from these germs like syphilis and gonorrhea and influenza, TB and radium poisoning. And so every day you'll go around your house and go, radium be gone. And you're like a happier soul as a result, because you're going to have a longer life. So this takes us back to Fred and Ginger. So now I think you might have a slightly better understanding of why this movie and so many other Art Deco movies were so incredibly popular during this time of the 1920s and 30s. I have not talked about the Great Depression, which is another topic that certainly could be added into all of this without any trouble whatsoever. But nonetheless, this fantasy that was being created, and when you look at this now, you can see it's just a stage set. This isn't reality by any means. This is real architecture. And that our two kind of hero and heroines, while they're very much enamored with one another, it's all very staged and posed. And they're doing all of this in order to try to elevate you from a very grim and dirty world, one that was filled with danger and strife, to one that would be the future, the modern world, something that would be so much easier and more desirable, cleaner and safer, where people could love, could enter into relationships without worrying about disease or death. And those were very, very real things during this time. And it's that would compel this to be one of the most popular movies, as well as all of the other movies that were being created during this time, as a way to kind of help people. So when you look at that trivet now, I hope you realize that that's not just a trivet. That trivet is really about people's dreams and hopes, their desires to be something bigger and grander than themselves, their hope that their bodies won't give out on them, that they'll live, and they'll live in a perfect world, one of great beauty, one where desires are met and hopes are fulfilled. I think that you can see this in a quote by Roger Ebert that I particularly liked when I was doing some research on Top Hat, where he talks about we need a Fred and Ginger because it is something for us to fantasize about. And the only thing I would just add to the very end of all of that is that we need Art Deco too. We need a style in order to help fuel our fantasies and our dreams. So, thank you all very much for coming out today. So, if we do have a little time, I think our next talk is at 6. We have 3 of the curators from the Wilsonian, actually one formerly from the Wilsonian and then 2 from the Wilsonian. We're going to be speaking about the show upstairs, and so I encourage you to come back for that. But before that, if you have any questions that I can answer or attempt to answer.
Going back to the first images of your talk, both the healthy, strong men and women, partly nude, and the ideas of power and speed that you introduced, that one about the railroad.
Right.
I was put in mind of the Nazi aesthetic, and I'm wondering whether that has occurred to you.
So this language, I mean, one of its powers, but also perhaps one of its downsides, is that it is extraordinarily flexible, and I think that it's one of the points that the Wilsonian makes on an ongoing basis, is that the arts can be used for good and for bad, and the very language that can be used for good in order to create hopeful fantasies that we might all share in can also be used to create dark fantasies that maybe fewer of us would share in. But it can be that same language, and so you're not mistaken. There's a number of similarities there in terms of the visual language that's being used. It's just having different purposes and who's manipulating that language in order to try to get some kind of result or some kind of feedback. Well, you were all very kind to sit indoors and to listen about Deco.